Good morning, everyone. I was about to say good afternoon, but we've still got about 30 minutes till noon. I just want to make a few housekeeping remarks as it relates to today's webinar on the intersection of domestic violence and substance abuse. We will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom for you to submit your questions. There will be a point later on in the presentation when Lauren Anderson will ask you to use the chat feature. And so go ahead and use the chat feature during that time. Also, we will be recording this webinar to make it available for those who were not able to attend this presentation. So just want to make you all aware. So we'll go ahead and get started. I want to introduce TAUW President and CEO, Allison Anthony. Allison?
Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'm so excited to see we have over 75 participants on the call today, and that's wonderful because this is such an important topic, and I'm just really grateful that you're taking the time to join us for this crucial community conversation. And I know I'm looking forward to insights. I always gain a lot of great information from our friends at 12 and 12 and Domestic Violence Intervention Services. So thank you for joining. And we are honored to work in a community space where we can host timely and relevant discussions as we all navigate this pandemic together. And today you're going to hear from two of our amazing 59 partner agencies. And we're just excited that we can both fund financially, raise the funds to fund financially, and also collaborate throughout the year. So you probably know, but you're seeing on the screen there, our main pillars of work are education, health and safety, and financial stability. Additionally, and more, we find ourselves living our mission in a particular area. Our mission is to unite people and resources to improve lives and strengthen communities. And we have found ourselves really playing that role largely in crisis response. We've done that with the Tulsa teacher walkout in the spring of 2018. Last year we had floods and tornadoes, and this year we have COVID-19. So some of the ways we've been working on that this year include setting up and helping raise funds for the Tulsa area COVID-19 response fund that we've managed in partnership with Tulsa Community Foundation. That fund has raised and is currently distributing near $3.6 million into the community related to COVID hardships. Additionally, we support and are helping the county distribute and get the stimulus funds out the door, which is so critical. And now we're turning back quite in a big way with school support. The great news is we've been able to leverage the work that we did in 2018 with geo-mapping and sharing some resources, and we're trying to walk the talk. We don't think it should just be the teachers or just the parents or just the schools to figure out this problem. And so even in our own school, in our own building, we're going to be having a little bit of school. Some of our employees are going to be bringing their kids with them. We have a big room where we can be socially distanced. And my kids told me last night that if I get to be a teacher for one of the days, that they'll be really wanting their teachers back. That's my children's perspective. So hopefully, I promise I'll be good to them. Lot going on, in other words, and you can see we also are busy accepting applications for our social innovation grant. Our 59 partner agencies are the social safety net, and then we also fund many community collaborations. And so as we enter 2020 fundraising campaign, and it is going to be a year like no other, this year we're really rallying around the theme of United in Hope. And we're united in hope as a strategy that in the belief that the future is going to be better today, and that we each have a role in making it so. And that as we set our goals and define our pathways to move forward, and agency and the will to make change, we can do something amazing in this community, coming together and really running a virtual campaign that is going to reach people in new and different ways. But we know Tulsa always comes together to help us with our strong work of the agencies that you're getting ready to hear from. Here are just some ways to get connected. We encourage you to follow us digitally. We've got some great tools I just want to give a shout out to Krista and her team and Lauren Zelligson, who manages our social media. Those folks do an incredible job with a vast amount of information, trying to get word out to the community. So now I'm going to turn it over to two experts that you have the opportunity to hear today and why you've called in. And now there's nearly 100. We're at 92 participants. So thank you for that. I know you're going to get a lot of information. My family has personally been touched by addiction, and I know how important agencies like 12 and 12 are. I know that, sadly, we all know someone who's been impacted by domestic violence or addiction, and it's so important too to understand the intersection of those areas. So I know right now, I'll just say in conclusion, that as people get ready to try to figure out what the school year brings, and we're sinking into this new normal of the pandemic, I'm seeing a lot of tears. I'm seeing a lot of frustrations among people. And I think we've all had the opportunity to develop our compassion muscle. And we know that people are being impacted by the pandemic in ways that they've never been impacted before. And some people who have been our donors in the past are now our clients and now finding themselves in need. And so now more than ever, we all need to be compassionate and take care of each other and understand some of the underlying challenges that people are facing as we navigate this new reality. So with that, I'm honored to introduce Lauren Anderson, who's a survivors counselor with DVIS, and Amy Hardy, who's also my yoga buddy and a clinical survivor for integrated residential treatment and transitional living at 12 and 12. Lauren and Amy, we're honored to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Allison. So Amy and I are going to spend some time talking to you guys about domestic violence and substance abuse. I know we don't have a whole lot of time and it feels like there's a lot of information for us to go through. So I will, when I'm done speaking, I'll put my email in the chat box. So if anyone wants to reach out and have further conversations with me, you can do so through my email. Krista, if you want to move to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about our statistics from 2019. DVIS has provided counseling to victims of rape and sexual assault, to survivors of domestic violence, and to perpetrators or batterers of domestic violence. Our batterers program we call BIP, and we have a BIP program for men and women both. It's a 52-week program. Typically, clients are referred by the court or by DHS. There is a $95 fee for the initial assessment, and then if the client is then referred to group, there's a $25 fee for each group that they attend. And again, that's a 52-week program. DVIS also provides children's services, so counseling to children of domestic violence survivors, as well as child care for parents who are receiving counseling services, legal services, court advocacy, things like that. Next slide, please. DVIS also provides advocacy to victims of rape and sexual assault, to people seeking court advocacy services and protective orders through our Family Safety Center, victims working with law enforcement, and individuals with information and crisis line calls. DVIS also provides housing for survivors and children at our shelter, as well as our transitional living facility. And then I really love this bottom stat. There we go. I love the bottom stat about dogs and cats because working firsthand with survivors, it's really hard to leave our pets behind. They feel like family. So I love that our shelter has a space for us to bring along cats and dogs. DVIS also provides legal services for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And then we have educational outreach and presentations to adults and teens and student athletes. Next slide, please. So I know this is a little hard to see, but I wanted to add it in here because I think it's really important information for us to be aware of. So this first chart is outpatient domestic violence barriers, survivor barriers to counseling services in 2019. So as you can see in this first chart, there are lots of barriers that become factors for clients receiving services, but the largest one here is transportation. And in this second chart shows barriers for our clients who are survivors of sexual assault. So not as many barriers were reported, but transportation is still one of the largest barriers that are faced across both domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. So before I get to talking about different pieces of domestic violence, I thought it would be helpful to kind of define what domestic violence is. And domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behaviors used by a person to gain power and control over another person in the relationship in the context of intimate partner relationships. And this can happen with a current or an ex-partner. Sometimes the most dangerous part of a relationship is that first year when it's ended, when that power and control seems to be lost and that abusive partner is kind of grabbing it, still maintaining or trying to gain power and control over their partner still. So now let's talk about types of abuse. And this is where, if you guys are willing to use your chat function, we're going to interact a little bit for this piece. So we're going to start with talking about physical types of abuse. I'm going to pull up the chat so that I can see responses. And if you will, just put in the chat what comes to mind when you hear physical abuse. What do you think physical abuse might mean? Hitting, punching, slapping, kicking, hitting, bruises, shoving, yes. Yeah. Choking, yes. So at Divis, we like to differentiate choking from strangulation. And so when we differentiate this to clients, we talk about, choking is internal, so something lodged in the airway preventing us from breathing. But strangulation is an external force that's making it hard for us to breathe. So body weight being put against the chest or the neck, hands being put around the neck. So again, that choking is an internal inhibitor of our breathing, and strangulation is an external force that's inhibiting our breathing. Restraint, I see hair pulling, raised fists. Yeah, those are great responses. I like that someone pointed out raised fists, because that reminds us that physical violence isn't always skin-to-skin contact between people, but sometimes it's things like intimidation. So a raised fist, they haven't hit you yet, but they're using intimidation to gain that power and control. Now let's move on to verbal and emotional abuse. So respond in the chat, if you will. What comes to mind when you hear verbal emotional abuse? Threats, yelling, yes. Mind games, name calling, gaslighting, absolutely. Gaslighting really fits in that psychological abuse, put downs, manipulation. Sarcasm certainly can be a form of verbal and emotional abuse. Belittling, silent treatment, insults, yes. Restricting what the person can or cannot do, that kind of that isolation piece, controlling the partner. And you guys already answered too for psychological abuse. I saw a few people respond and say gaslighting. Absolutely, that's a big piece of psychological abuse. So gaslighting is manipulating someone by psychological means into questioning their own sanity. And gaslighting is repetitive, or it wouldn't be effective. So when we have individuals who are using psychological abuse, this gaslighting is going on and on and on, because it takes several times before that partner begins to really question their sanity. Let's move down to sexual abuse. So what do we think about when we hear sexual abuse? I see somebody asked, is downplaying the issue psychological? Yes. It is, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit, that minimizing and denying and blaming. So sexual abuse, I see rape, unwanted touching, lack of consent, yes. Forcing frequency, more or less frequent, yep. Withholding sex, or wanting to have sex all the time when your partner doesn't. Some important pieces of this are remembering that sometimes, and forcing to watch porn, yes, that's an important one too. Something important that to think about when we hear sexual abuse is that when we're in these relationships, sometimes the partner that is being abused consents to sex, right? So they're agreeing to go along with this sexual activity. However, they're only agreeing to it because they would rather do this than deal with what might happen if they say no, or not right now, or I'm not in the mood. So there might be times where there is technically consent there. They're willingly going along with it, but it's only to prevent, you know, a fight later or an argument later. Financial abuse. This is having access or control of all finances. You know, maybe he works, she doesn't, and he controls all the money. Or, you know, she works and he chooses not to, but her money is going into a bank account that he controls. What comes to mind when I say religious abuse? What do we think that might be? Using the Bible to control, absolutely. Religion as a way of manipulation, using guilt and shame, preventing religious freedom, yeah. Forcing sex for religious reasons, yes. Not allowing someone to attend services, forcing your beliefs. Yes, these are all great answers, correct. And then we have stalking and digital, and sometimes these can be used together. We can stalk people in a digital way because things are so accessible through social media now. So, you know, stalking, showing up and following somebody when they don't want you to do that. GPS on your phone or car, yes, absolutely. When we're safety planning, it's important to remind survivors, you know, turn off your location services. Maybe take your phone to your provider and have them check it out. Make sure that there's nothing in there that's allowing this person to keep tabs on you through GPS. Yes, calling all the time, texting all the time, that absolutely is stalking and digital stalking. Controlling email, yes, great. Those are all great answers. Krista, if you will go to the next slide, please. Thank you guys for using that chat feature and interacting with me on types of abuse. So this is the cycle, or this is the power and control wheel. We talk about this a lot at Divis with our clients. So as you see in the center, it says power and control, and each piece of this wheel are ways that individuals attempt to gain power and control over another. The first one I'm going to start with is this piece of using intimidation. So we've already kind of talked about a lot of these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them for time's sake. But using intimidation, making your partner feel afraid by looks, actions, gestures. Using emotional abuse to gain power and control, really breaking your partner down. Using isolation, so controlling where this person's going, who they're interacting with, what they see, what they read. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, so making light of the abuse that happened, or saying that it didn't happen, or it wasn't as bad as what your partner maybe says that it was. Using children, so making your partner feel guilty about children. Using visitation to harass the partner. Then there's this piece of male privilege, and this is really just being the one to define the men and the women's roles. I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. Using economic abuse, we talked about that piece of financial abuse, so that's what this is here. And using coercion and threats, so making or carrying out threats to do something to hurt the partner, threatening suicide, threatening to report your partner to welfare, making them drop charges that maybe were previously filed. So again, these are all ways that individuals attempt to gain power and control in a relationship. Krista, if you'll go to the next slide, please. So here's the cycle of violence. And the reason this is important is because even though in abusive relationships, you know, they vary across the board, they all seem to follow and fit in with this cycle. So we have the honeymoon phase, the tension phase, the explosion phase, and the remorse phase. The tension phase is where the person being abused, here it says victim, feels like they're walking on eggshells. They're doing all they can to keep the peace, where the abusive partner seems to escalate. They begin isolating the partner. Maybe this is where the emotional and psychological abuse happen. There might be an increase in drinking or substance use. And then at some point we get into the explosion phase. This is where we see a lot of physical abuse, where we see sexual abuse, you know, breaking the phone if the partner's trying to call 911 or call for help. And then the victim here is trying to protect themselves. You know, this is where maybe they're filing for a police order. They leave their partner, or they attempt to fight back. Then we move into this remorse phase. So the abusive partner then apologizes. This might be where we see some of that minimizing, denying, and blaming. So some of that psychological abuse. Oh, it wasn't as bad as what you think it was. It wasn't my fault. It was your fault that this happened. Blames it on alcohol and on drug use. Makes promises to the partner. I'll do better. I want to be with you. I can't live without you. And then the victim here may forgive and agree to come back to the abusive partner, trying to stop any legal proceedings. If they went and filed for a protective order, they may drop the protective order when they're in this remorse phase. And then they go into the honeymoon phase. So the abusive partner may start to follow through on some of the promises that they had made. And then the victim kind of has this sense of hope that, oh, this is what I've been waiting for in the relationship. He's finally doing the things that I want. So it's important to note that in this cycle of violence, there's not an exact timeline where we see this. You know, it may take an hour for your partner to get through all 4 of these phases, and it may take a month or it may take a year. And some of these phases take longer than the other. You might be in the tension phase for weeks before getting into the explosion phase. And then when you're in the remorse phase, maybe it only lasts for a few days. Kristen, next slide. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about trauma reactions. I think the biggest trauma reaction to talk about is our fight, flight, and freeze reaction. So when we're confronted with danger, we have one of 3 responses: that fight, flight, or freeze. And over time, we become really efficient in recognizing what's previously been dangerous. However, when we're repeatedly exposed to trauma, we start to get what we call false danger signals. So when we're confronted with a dangerous situation, our bodies naturally respond by going into that fight, flight, and freeze, and our non-essential functions shut down. So an example of that could be our frontal lobe. And so our frontal lobe is where it's our rational part of our brain. It's the decision-making part of our brain. And the reason that shuts down is to keep us safe. So for example, we're crossing the street and we see a car coming quickly at us. We analyze that that's danger, and hopefully we go into fight, flight, and freeze, hopefully flight, because this car is coming at us and we want to run out of the way for safety. If our non-essential functions did not shut down, so in this case, our frontal lobe, our rational decision-making brain, when we see that car coming towards us, we might begin to try to rationalize what's happening. Why is this car hurtling towards me? Okay, I know I need to get out of the way, but how do I do that? Do I run to the right or do I run to the left? You know, so as we begin to use this front part of our brain to rationalize what's happened and how we respond to it, it's too much time, and then the car could hit us. So our non-essential functions shut down so that our body's natural instincts can kick in to keep us safe. This can become somewhat problematic, like I mentioned, when we're repeatedly exposed to trauma, because what happens is typically when our alarm system goes off, we scan for danger. And if there's not any perceived danger, we're able to go on doing whatever it was we were doing. However, when we're exposed to trauma, we develop overactive alarms and we perceive danger, 1, more quickly, and 2, we might incorrectly label danger. So we go into this fight, flight, and freeze when there's not any real danger around us. We've just perceived there to be danger. We also have reactions such as dissociation. Sometimes what we go through is so hard that I have to leave through my mind in order to survive what may be happening. There are anger outbursts, hyperarousal, which is that overactive alarm that I just talked about, anxiety, and then feeling numb or having a lack of emotion. So what happens after trauma? I think a really common thing that we probably hear about is PTSD. And so we certainly can experience symptoms of PTSD without having a diagnosis of PTSD. So I just listed some of those here. Re-experiencing the trauma through nightmares or through flashbacks, avoiding trauma reminders. You know, if you get in a really bad car wreck on the way to work, you might decide to choose another route to work to avoid that place where you had the car wreck, even if it takes 30 minutes to an hour longer to get where you're going. Persistent negative beliefs, and this can be about yourself or about the world in general, and an inability to experience positive emotions, having a lack of interest in activities, having a sleep disturbance, And some other symptoms that may come up are change in worldview, so that persistent negative beliefs that I talked about, feeling depressed, experiencing guilt and blame. You know, it's my fault that this happened to me. Maybe if I wouldn't have done this, it wouldn't have happened, or maybe I should have done this instead. We can get a hyperactive nervous system. After being in abusive relationships, sometimes we see suicidal behaviors in females, low self-esteem, an inability to trust men, fear of intimacy, and then self-harming behaviors, so cutting and then abuse of alcohol or drugs. So now we're going to talk about some health consequences. Injuries that are sustained during violent episodes can be linked to really adverse physical health problems, and they're listed here. As you can see, there's lots of chronic pains, STIs, stomach ulcers. If you'll go to the next slide, Krista. Here's some continued health consequences. So bruises from physical abuse, knife wounds, pelvic pains, broken bones. You can have pregnancy difficulties, central nervous system disorders, gastrointestinal problems, and heart or circulatory conditions. So now we're going to go into talking a little bit about domestic violence and substance abuse together. So the quotes that you see here are from a book by Lundy Bancroft called Why Does He Do That? The first one reads, addiction is not the cause of a man's abuse of his partner, but it can contribute to the severity of the problem and the resistance to change. And then the last quote reads, addiction does not cause partner abuse, and recovery from addiction does not cure partner abuse. So there's a disclosure in the middle of them stating that not all perpetrators are men. So yes, these quotes use masculine terms, but not all perpetrators are men. And statistically, Divis recognizes that about 80% of abusers are male. Next slide, please. So here's, back one. There we go. Thank you, Krista. Here are some similarities and some differences, and these can be found in that book that I just mentioned, Why Does He Do That, by Lundy Bancroft. So some similarities are escalation in behavior, that piece of denial, minimizing, blaming, choosing approving peers, so wanting to be surrounded by people who aren't going to nag you for the choices that you're making, but they're approving of the choices you're making, or maybe they just don't confront you or try to talk to you about the choices you're making. Lying and manipulation, lack of predictability, and then high rates of returning to abuse after periods of what appears to be change. And then we have some differences. Partner abusers don't quote unquote hit rock bottom. You know, hit rock bottom is a term that maybe we hear a lot with individuals who have who abuse substances. Then we have this piece of short-term versus long-term rewards. So short-term for substance abuse, and that when you use a substance, you can get a high pretty quick. And then long-term more so for intimate partner violence. So there's a long-term reward in that over time, as you break down your partner, you become the most important person in that relationship. You know, your career matters, your educational wants and needs matter. It's kind of revolving around you. So over time, there are long-term rewards. And then societal approval for partner abuse is greater than that of substance abuse.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. So much great information. And thank you, everyone, for joining us in the middle of your busy day. I'm Amy. So I'm going to kind of take us through the other side of that, as in what happens now that we've intersected with substance abuse, and how does that affect domestic violence as a whole, not just the problem of it, but the solution to it also. So adding substances is exactly like throwing gas on the fire to this. In preparation for this webinar, what I did is I created an anonymous survey to give to our client population, because what better way to gather information than to ask the people seeking help that we have in the building right now here at 12 and 12. And so we surveyed 82 clients. 70% of them reported that they had experienced domestic violence in their lifetime. And out of those 70%, 100% of them reported that substance use, either theirs or their partners, contributed significantly to the abuse. And when asked how did drugs and alcohol contribute to the abuse, some of the reasons that we got were I lowered my inhibition, I was very impulsive. There's a part of your brain called the VTA, ventral tegmental area, and this part of your brain controls your ability to accurately assess risk and reward. And when you're intoxicated, it throws the accuracy of this off. This part of your brain is highly affected. What that means is that your
Sorry, everyone. It looks like we lost Amy. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you, Krista, and maybe Lauren could take some questions, some of the questions that came in for Laura while we wait to get Amy back.
I can take questions. I didn't see any in the question and answer box.
I saw a question, Lauren, about do terms or issues change for same-sex relationships?
From my experience in working, we still see this power and control dynamic. So there, even in same-sex relationships, we still see that there's one person attempting to gain that power and control over another. So I think in that way, the terminology doesn't really change because it's still kind of the same dynamic that's a driving force for that power and control and the abuse in that relationship. Does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm. And I see another question that's come in. What are some signs that domestic or sexual abuse is occurring, particularly in a quarantine type situation?
This can really vary depending on the person, but I think some signs to be aware of are if someone starts to really isolate themselves more than normal. That could be because a lot of times we see that survivors are embarrassed about their situation. You know, we don't imagine ourselves getting into a relationship where someone's harming us. And so, you know, when we do that, kind of like I mentioned earlier, we have this piece of guilt and blame on ourselves. And so it's hard to be around people because we feel like, you know, it's my fault that this is happening. It's not the other person, it's me that there's a problem with. So definitely some isolation. Now I know that when we're quarantined, we're already isolating quite a bit, but you know, if this is a person that typically talks to you quite a bit and they're not, or, you know, it's hot outside and we may notice that if there's bruising, survivors will wear things to cover that up. And so if you start to notice things like that, that certainly can be a sign. Something that we see as well with sexual abuse is this piece of not wanting to be touched by anybody. And so if they're kind of cowering down when you want to hug them, or it feels uncomfortable, you notice those can be some signs as well. I see quite a few questions coming in as well. I don't know where we're at.
I see a new question here that about the term, I think that some people hadn't heard before, freeze. What term did you use when the fight, flight, freeze is exhausted?
Is exhausted. We call it, or I call it, an overactive alarm system. So when we're constantly faced with danger and we're constantly having to utilize that fight, flight, and freeze, our brain remembers that pathway. And so it just, instead of scanning for danger, it just automatically jumps into that fight, flight, and freeze.
And then what's the best way to approach someone that you think may be in an abuse situation?
Honestly, being there for them and being supportive of them is really important. It can be really hard to understand abusive relationships when you're on the outside or you haven't experienced that. And I know that it means a lot to survivors when they have a support system wrapped around them. So just being supportive of them and knowing that it's very common for, when survivors leave, it's very common for them to return to the abusive relationship. And so still keeping that support open for them and understanding like that's normal. And while it's, frustrating, certainly that this person continues to go back to someone that hurts them, it makes more of a difference than we realize when you keep that support open for them, when you're somebody that's safe for them to talk to or to stay with if they need to leave again.
One more question and then we'll go back to Amy.
Okay.
And this has happened to me. What if you're at a gas station, a quick trip, and you see something happening right there in the parking lot in front of you? What should you do?
I guess I don't really have, a perfect answer for that, because that's a scary situation to be in, right? And what I've learned about abusive relationships is, a lot of times we tell clients that if you are needing to flee physical abuse, sometimes the safest place to be is out in public, because more often than not, that abusive person's not going to be abusive to you in front of all these witnesses. I would say, and this is not necessarily professionally, just kind of a personal thought, I would say definitely don't try to involve yourself, because that's certainly dangerous. Calling 911 is what I would say might be the best there. But again, that's not really a professional opinion or professionally motivated answer, just kind of my own thoughts.
I'm back. Can anyone
hear me back? Amy, we have you back. I'll turn it back to you.
Wow, what an adventure. So
it's happened to all of us at this point.
Apparently the whole building blipped over here. Lauren, thank you so much for jumping in. I sure do appreciate that. Where did we leave off? All right. So,
Amy, it looks like you left off.
With these wonderful quotes down here.
Yes.
So I put a couple of quotes up on the slide that I thought were kind of significant of the problem. And as you can read there, there's a lot of blaming someone else's behavior on self or substances. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide, Krista, thank you. All right, so breaking things down by gender, you see that almost all of the women reported experience with domestic violence compared to still a significant number of the men. But the number of clients reporting that they've survived domestic violence was pretty comparable. More women than I thought would have reported being both the victim and the abuser, compared to 39% of men. And now the average length of the abusive relationships for our clients was pretty close to the same between genders, but you'll notice that it seems like women will stay in these relationships quite a bit longer than men, with the longest reported relationship, 40 years. Next slide. Thank you. So I looked at, how do you get out of this situation? What do you do when you're ready to leave? And I had another counselor here tell me that on average, it takes women 7 attempts before they officially leave an abusive relationship, if they can survive for that long. So it took up to 26% of the women, significantly less for the men, to get legal help to leave the relationship. And we're looking at restraining orders, calling the police. One of the men even reported he escaped by going to prison. And a pretty average number, equal number of people needing to just relocate, move, completely escape the relationship. Fewer reported they were able to just end the relationship, break up, and move on. A significant amount of the women stated that they ended the relationship by coming to 12 and 12 for substance use treatment. And you'll see that there's also the issue of having it be a medical emergency. I left by, it almost cost me my life. I was left for dead. And one client, interestingly enough, reported that he escaped his abusive marriage by going to live with his girlfriend. So which substances did clients report contributed the most to their domestic violence situations? And the winner of that question, oh, they're all number one, that's funny, is methamphetamines at 53%. And if you think of the effects of this drug on the human system, a lot of increased adrenaline, a lot of increased aggression, that's not surprising that it would be reported the most. Second is alcohol at 46%, and then heroin with, you can see in my pie chart, marijuana, pills, and cocaine tie for last, with everything coming in fourth. And that's really not too surprising to get those results also. So next slide. All right. So abuse can be a learned behavior also. It gets very normalized growing up with it. So I wanted to kind of get some idea of the numbers where that's concerned also. And you see that half or over half of all the clients here that reported domestic violence reported witnessing it as a child, and only slightly less said that it was a regular occurrence in their home growing up. Next slide. Thank you. So with those numbers being so high, it's a little alarming that such a high percentage of clients had never received getting treatment for domestic violence before coming to 12 and 12. And some of the reasons for that were shame and guilt, or they just weren't able to, it was too hard to talk about. So there's a lot of similarities between the cycle of violence that Lauren went over and the addiction cycle. We've got that honeymoon period, that's the substance abuse and addictive behaviors, the ritual that goes along with it. And then you have the remorse and guilt stage, the trigger, the upward climb through cravings, back to drug use. Go ahead and switch slides. But there's a special relationship between trauma and addiction. That's a very symbiotic relationship. You can liken it to which came first, the chicken or the egg. Say the substance use comes first. Well, through that affected VTA part of your brain, you're going to find yourself in situations where you are highly likely to be traumatized by life, by situations, by people that you hang out with. And then once that trauma happens, you're going to experience symptoms of PTSD, just trauma symptoms, which usually get medicated by drugs and alcohol, resulting in more situations where you're likely to get traumatized. If the trauma comes first, it's the same cycle. You're traumatized, you're going to treat those symptoms with substance use, and then you're going to get traumatized again. And it just keeps going and going and going until something comes along to help you get treatment and get through it. All right, treatment obstacles. For the survivors of domestic violence, we've got all the things that Lauren's already mentioned, transportation, money, childcare, safety. Sometimes it's hard to even get out of the home to access help. So once the client gets here, what become the obstacles now that they're in a safe place where they can receive treatment? And the big obstacles in receiving treatment for trauma and substance use are the symptoms of trauma and substance use. All of the symptoms, the four clusters: re-experiencing symptoms, avoidance symptoms, negative cognition and mood, and then the arousal symptoms, all of those that Lauren touched on really well. All of these trigger cravings for substance use. And a lot of times when we start to get into the trauma, all of these symptoms start triggering cravings, and it's too much for the client to take, and they discharge against counselor's advice and relapse outside of treatment. Next slide, thank you. So some of the treatment obstacles for abusers are the same. Part of that is that normalized behavior where they don't think they have a problem. This is normal behavior. This is what we learned growing up a relationship looks like. Another obstacle is the shame and guilt. Now that the substance use has stopped, reality kind of sets in, and some people are overwhelmed with the reality of their behavior. There's also the fear of being judged or reported. But especially what we've noticed is dealing with their own trauma becomes the big barrier for all of the reasons that we've already mentioned. Treatment obstacles for clinicians. This is the one that they don't highlight so much when you're going through school. At least they didn't for me, and now it's a huge part of just everyday life as a counselor treating people with trauma. Conscious or subconscious bias. Sometimes we're not aware that we have these biases. Could trigger a symptom that reminds of personal trauma. Most people become a counselor for this situation because it's touched their lives in some way already and they've worked to overcome it. This is the big one for me, especially vicarious trauma, which is getting traumatized by other people's trauma. And it's a real thing. And I had experience with this myself back when, about 5 years ago, when Oklahoma had the big problem with human trafficking. And I don't know if anyone remembers, there was an organization that came through the state called Operation Unlock Her Freedom. And they did huge, huge things for busting up human trafficking rings and liberating a lot of the workers in there. And so there was about a 6-month period where most of my caseload was made up of women who had recently been pulled out of human trafficking situations. And listening to those stories over and over again, it really affected me deeply. I struggled a lot for several months. And then another issue that we face is compassion fatigue, which is just getting burned out by all the trauma and all the work psychologically that goes into walking someone through their trauma. So next slide, how are we doing on time, okay? So how do we really address trauma and domestic violence? How do we treat those things? It doesn't matter which came first, the chicken or the egg. We treat them both together at the same time. And you're going to see here on the slide these standards for treating these things. And I'm not going to go too deeply into this. Cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive behavioral therapy, psychotherapy, DBT, motivational interviewing. What we're really looking at is analyzing the thought to belief to behavior pattern, figuring out which of the beliefs that I've based all my behavior on are irrational, and finding ways to replace those with rational, truthful beliefs so that my behavior changes and then my beliefs change. So go ahead to the next slide. We also have acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, a really great intervention to use, highlighting mindfulness and self-acceptance. Gestalt and experiential techniques, empty chair has been proven really, really useful in helping people finally confront an abuser after the fact to get some closure. Narrative therapy works really well. Also, cognitive processing therapy is something that the Veterans Association has been using for the past few years for combat PTSD, and with a lot of success. And the main tenet of that is challenging the irrational beliefs like I deserved it, or as an 8-year-old child, I could have stopped it, labeling that as a stuck point and then moving through it by figuring out the irrationality to it and changing that. So I touched a little bit on vicarious trauma, and self-care is a huge, huge, huge part of just daily activity for counselors working with people dealing with this level of trauma. We process with other clinicians. We have to talk about what we're hearing. We listen every day to some of the worst things one human can do to another human. We can't take it home with us. You have to leave work at work. Self-care has become a huge movement in this industry. Self-care, mental, emotional, spiritual, physical. So when I was dealing with my vicarious trauma, the coping mechanism I found that worked for me, which is why we have this very bizarre picture that we're looking at, was circus arts and acrobatics. And so this is a picture of me on the top of that pyramid coping with vicarious trauma through performing acrobatics for the Special Olympics. The thing that I have found to be the most useful in helping counselors get through these things is to have fun every day, just doing something fun. And that's the end of my slides. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties there, but I think I managed to leave us a good 10 minutes for question and answers.
Amy and Lauren, thank you so much. This is great information. I know we're going to all leave with some tools to address issues within our own lives, or even reach out and help friends. So this is really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. And now we're going to use the remaining time we have to answer questions. And there were some that were put in the chat that we haven't been able to get to yet. So I'd like to go ahead and pick back up with the Q&A. And Diana Emerson asks, I think you might have addressed this already, but if you would like to add anything else, but she asked, how much impact does generational abuse have? For example, how many abusers, victims were raised with that?
So we give an assessment called the ACE assessment, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, which collects data about some things that we experience through childhood that relate to these different types of abuse. You know, whether we were victims of abuse as children or whether we witnessed domestic violence in the home as children. And so that is data that we collect. I don't have that information at hand right now, but you guys are more than welcome to reach out to me through my email, and I would love to give you that information that we have.
And Amy and Lauren, if you could post again in the chat to all panelists and attendees your email address so that they have that. And then April asks, how can you work with someone who refuses to leave an abuser?
It's tough. I'm going to be honest, it's really hard. But at the same time, I guess it comes back to it's my job. It's the job I chose to do. And for me personally, I just have to get to a place of understanding it's not my job to make this person do anything. What is my job is to provide them with the support, information, and resources that they come to me and need. And sometimes it may take a long time for someone to leave and to finally leave. You know, like I said, there is a lot of that returning back into the abusive situations. And there's pieces of that I know that help me in that. There's a comfort there. You know, when we look at abusive relationships, yes, there's abuse, but there's also a love that, you know, maybe we don't understand because we aren't in an abusive relationship. You know, our thoughts might be, how do you love somebody that hurts you? But there is a love there. And what we see in abusive relationships as well is codependency. And so when we see survivors try to leave and to be on their own, it's a struggle. It's hard. You know, they can't afford housing. They can't afford to take care of the children on their own. And so they think that it's easier to just stay in this abusive relationship. And I think for me, knowing all of that information is something that helps me in working with people who do kind of go back and forth.
The next question is really relevant because so many of us are working from home these days due to the pandemic. Someone is asking, how can a person not take things home when many are still working from home? Suggestions?
To me, that's about putting in really good personal boundaries and then sticking to them. Working from home this spring, I think 12 and 12 clinical staff, we were at home for 10 or 11 weeks this spring. And we developed kind of like signing on, signing off procedures to let each other know, okay, I'm going here now, I'm done for the day. And sticking to that, you know, like once I was done for the day, I'm going to walk away from my computer and I'm not going to get back on it. And I'm not going to check emails and I'm going to do something else. What can I do for self-care? And one of the things that I asked staff to do that we actually had a lot of fun with was emailing pictures of what are we doing for self-care during this time. And we would get pictures of people gardening. We would get pictures of people, you know, walking around, pictures of the sunset. Of course, there was me, the weird acrobat, posting pictures of me upside down, weird places. But it was just some way for us to really connect together while making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. And when work was done for the day.
Those are great suggestions. Thanks, Amy. We've got a couple more questions to get to. What are the best self-care modes, methods that help clients with trauma and substance use issues specifically?
I don't know that I would say there are really specific methods for substance use. We try to look at individuals as individuals. So what works for one person to deal with an alcohol craving might not work for another person with the same problem. The best practice that we do is just to offer as many tools as possible, and something's going to work for everybody, though it might not be the same something. But one of the things that we're really quick to go to is anything having to do with mindfulness and self-awareness and relaxation techniques, because a lot of those issues that they come up are anxiety response related. So anything that helps to soothe the central nervous system is also always a good idea, and that's our first go-to.
We have a funding question. What are funding options for substance abuse treatment?
I'm not sure I understand the question in terms of someone seeking treatment.
Let's see, Diana, do you have, if you're still on the call, can you clarify your question? You can type that in the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to the next question. What are some of the best ways you have seen to get people to seek treatment, whether they leave the abuser or not?
Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. I guess personally, the biggest thing that I've seen is that, one, our counseling services are free. So there's not that obstacle of, I'm not gonna be able to afford help. I can't use my insurance because my partner would know. And something else that I've noticed too is, honestly, the more we're able to offer help, the more clients seem to want to engage in services. And so whenever we're able to help, even if it's a little bit financially in the leaving process, that's something that's helpful. Or, you know, we have clients that call in as crisis calls, and they just need to get out of state to leave their abuser. And sometimes we can help with gas cards and things like that. And so having resources and tools like that that we're able to offer survivors seeking help seems to be a good motivator.
We did get some clarification from Diana, and it has to do with how you pay for it. How can people pay for treatment if they don't have the funds for coverage?
There are numerous treatment facilities in Oklahoma that are funded through mostly or partially through ODMH and ODMH SAS. So if you just start calling places, you're going to find some places. Most, like, we're one of the places where we will provide treatment regardless of someone's ability to pay, usually through Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. So to get a comprehensive list of those places, the first place I would check is ODMH SAS. Give them a call, hit the website, and find out what's close to the area of the service needed, and then just take it from there.
We've got time for one last question, and the questions that we're not able to answer on this webinar, I will email to our panelists. The last question is, where can clients find help when they are in a verbal or emotional abusive relationship, but it hasn't been physical? I have run into problems where clients needed to get out, however, they were turned away because they were not hit. Any suggestions?
Well, first, DIVIS. Refer them to DIVIS for help is great, because, you know, here we know what abuse is. We don't think of abuse and just think, well, there has to be physical pieces for it to be abuse. And so referring them to DIVIS for advocacy, for counseling, is a really good first step. But that's a really frustrating situation to be in, because even working with clients here, we have clients who they're trying to file for a protective order from this individual, and the protective order keeps getting denied because there's not marks on my body. There's not proof that there's abuse happening. And so that's a really frustrating situation to be in. And I don't have the perfect answer for it, because we're fighting at Divis for that as well, for having justice in these situations where abuse seems to be not seen, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Amy. And thank you for everyone participating in this discussion today. It's a very important topic, and one that's very timely and relevant given all the isolating we've been doing during this pandemic. The webinar, as I said earlier, has been recorded, and we will make that available on our website at tauw.org. We'll also have the slides available. There was a question about whether the slides would be available, and yes, we'll make that available for download, as well as provide a video recording of the webinar. So that's all the time we have for today. Again, thank you to our wonderful panelists, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.